The periscope breaks the surface at 0500 hours on May 5, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Maiden peers through the lens at the harbor of Diego Suarez, Madagascar's northernmost port. He counts warships at anchor, notes the positions of coastal batteries, observes the morning routine of a French colonial garrison that has no idea what is coming. In 7 hours, 50,000 British and South African troops will land on beaches 20 miles from where Maiden's submarine HMS Severn sits submerged. In 3 days, those same troops will be fighting house to house in Diego Suarez against French forces who believe they are defending legitimate government authority. And for the next 6 months, this island, 800 miles long and 250 miles wide, will become the site of one of the war's strangest campaigns. An Allied invasion of French territory to prevent a Japanese occupation that might never have happened. Defended by Vichy forces, loyal to a government allied with Germany, but not technically at war with Britain. All playing out on an island most of the combatants had never heard of before receiving their orders. Madagascar mattered because of geography. The island sits in the western Indian Ocean, 250 miles off the coast of Mozambique. Its location dominates the Mozambique Channel, the shipping lane connecting the Persian Gulf to South Africa and the South Atlantic. Every convoy carrying oil from Iran to Egypt passed through these waters. Every troop ship moving reinforcements from India to the Middle East transited the channel. The island's harbors, particularly Diego Suarez in the north, could shelter an entire fleet with natural protection from storms and surveillance. In British hands, Madagascar was a strategic asset. In Japanese hands, it would be catastrophic. By early 1942, Japanese forces had conquered Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. Their submarines operated in the Indian Ocean with impunity. In April, a Japanese carrier task force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same officer who had commanded at Pearl Harbor, raided Ceylon. Japanese carrier aircraft sank the British cruisers HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, the carrier HMS Hermes, and 23 merchant ships. The raid demonstrated Japan's ability to project naval power across the entire Indian Ocean. Madagascar represented the next logical target. If Japan seized Diego Suarez and based submarines there, the entire Allied convoy system in the western Indian Ocean would collapse. The route from Persia to Egypt would become untenable. The sea link between India and Africa would be severed. The strategic consequences would rival the fall of Singapore. British intelligence had no evidence Japan intended to invade Madagascar, but the possibility was sufficient. The island was held by Vichy France, the collaborationist government that had signed an armistice with Germany in June 1940. Vichy claimed neutrality but operated under German oversight. If Berlin ordered Vichy to cede Madagascar to Japan, would the Vichy governor resist? The British doubted it. Preventive action was necessary. Planning for Operation Ironclad began in January 1942. The codename reflected the challenge. An amphibious assault on a heavily defended port, 5,000 miles from the nearest British base, against French forces whose response was unpredictable. They might surrender immediately. Recognizing the strategic logic, they might fight to the death, viewing the invasion as naked aggression against French sovereignty. The force assembled under Rear Admiral Edward Neville Seifert was substantial. The battleship HMS Ramillies, displacement 33,000 tons, 8 15-inch guns. The aircraft carriers HMS Illustrious and HMS Indomitable, carrying 42 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, 15 Fairey Albacore bombers, and 24 Grumman Martlet fighters between them, 2 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 6 corvettes, 6 minesweepers. The assault convoy carried 13,000 British troops from Force 121 and 16,000 South African troops from 5th Division. Additional vessels carried supplies, fuel, ammunition, and landing craft. The landing craft were the weakest element. Britain's amphibious warfare capability in early 1942 remained primitive. Most landing craft were converted barges, slow, unseaworthy, and vulnerable to any shore defense. The largest, the landing craft Assault, carried 35 men, measured 41 feet long, and had armor plating that might stop rifle bullets but nothing heavier. Maximum speed, 10 knots in calm water. In surf conditions, they wallowed dangerously. The plan called for landings at Courier Bay and Ambararata Bay, beaches on either side of the Diego Suarez Peninsula. Force 121 would land at Courier Bay, advance inland, and seize the high ground overlooking the port. 5th Division would land at Ironclad Bay, push east, and capture the airfield at Ironclad. Once the airfield was secure, RAF fighters would land and provide air cover for the final assault on Diego Suarez itself. The invasion fleet departed Durban, South Africa. On April 28th, the troops had received minimal intelligence about their objective. Most believed they were heading to India or Ceylon. Only senior officers knew the truth. They were invading French territory to prevent a hypothetical Japanese occupation. The legal and moral ambiguity was profound. France was not at war with Britain in any formal sense. Vichy claimed sovereignty over Madagascar. The invasion would be a violation of international law under almost any interpretation. Churchill approved it anyway. Strategic necessity overrode legal niceties. If the Japanese established themselves in Madagascar, the consequences would be measured in thousands of lives and millions of tons of shipping. Better to invade now and apologize later. If at all. The fleet approached Madagascar on May 4th. Weather was favorable. Calm seas, light winds, visibility good. HMS Severn and HMS Auriga, both submarines, had spent the previous week conducting reconnaissance, photographing beaches, charting coastal defenses, and observing French naval movements. Their reports confirmed the presence of 2 submarines, several sloops, and the armed merchant cruiser Bougainville in Diego Suarez Harbor. Coastal artillery included batteries of 5.5-inch guns positioned to cover the harbor approaches. The French garrison numbered approximately 3,000 troops under Governor-General Armand Anet. Most were colonial infantry. Malagasy soldiers led by French officers. 1 battalion of regular French infantry provided the core of the defense. Equipment was dated. Rifles from the First World War. Machine guns of 1920s vintage. No anti-tank weapons. Minimal anti-aircraft capability. But the troops were well trained, familiar with the terrain, and prepared to defend what they considered legitimate French territory. At 0400 hours on May 5th, the invasion began. British destroyers opened fire on coastal batteries, their 4.7-inch guns dropping shells onto French positions. The bombardment was brief, intended to suppress rather than destroy. At 0430, the first wave of landing craft pushed off from the transports and headed for Courier Bay. The sea remained calm. No French response came from the shore. The landing craft grounded on beaches of dark volcanic sand. Troops jumped out, waded through shallow surf, and advanced inland. They met no resistance. The beaches were undefended. Force 121's commander, Major General Robert Sturgis, had expected opposition. French doctrine emphasized beach defense. The absence of defenders suggested either catastrophic intelligence failure or strategic withdrawal. Sturgis pushed his troops forward cautiously, expecting ambush. Instead, they found only empty pillboxes and unmanned positions. By 0700 hours, the entire assault force was ashore and advancing on the first objective, the village of Courier, 3 miles inland. The first contact came at 0815. French colonial infantry dug in on ridges overlooking the advance, opened fire with machine guns and mortars. British troops took cover and returned fire. The engagement lasted 30 minutes before French forces withdrew. British casualties, 12 wounded. French casualties, unknown. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. French forces contested every ridge, every village, every crossroads, then fell back before being enveloped. It was delaying action, not defense in depth. Sturgis recognized the tactic. The French were trading space for time, falling back toward prepared positions around Diego Suarez, while inflicting casualties and slowing the British advance. At Ironclad Bay, 5th Division encountered stiffer resistance. The beaches there were more exposed. The approaches covered by machine gun nests in rocky outcrops. South African troops came ashore under fire. Landing craft took hits. 1 craft carrying 40 men struck a submerged rock and capsized. 32 men drowned in surf and equipment too heavy to swim in. By noon on May 5th, both landing forces had pushed several miles inland but were behind schedule. The French were fighting harder than anticipated, their colonial troops showing discipline and courage. More critically, the terrain was worse than intelligence had suggested. Madagascar's northern region was a maze of ravines, thick vegetation, and volcanic ridges that channeled movement and favored defense. Roads shown on maps didn't exist. Trails marked as passable were impassable to vehicles. The RAF arrived overhead at 1400 hours. 6 ferry swordfish from Illustrious, tasked with bombing Ironclad airfield to prevent French aircraft from interfering with the landings. The Swordfish found the airfield defended by anti-aircraft guns that opened accurate fire. One aircraft was shot down. The rest dropped their bombs, hitting the runway and destroying two Morane Saulinier MS-406 fighters on the ground. The French had fewer than a dozen aircraft on Madagascar, obsolete machines maintained with scrounged parts, but they represented a threat to landing craft and beach supply dumps. Ground forces continued their advance through the afternoon. By 1800 hours, British troops had reached positions overlooking Diego Suarez from the west. The town spread below them. Colonial architecture, warehouses near the harbor, barracks for the garrison. The harbor itself sheltered the submarine Beauvaisier and several smaller vessels. Coastal guns dominated the approaches. Taking the town would require house-to-house fighting against defenders who knew every street and alley. Sturgis requested naval gunfire support. At 0600 hours on May 6th, HMS Ramillies closed to within 10,000 yards of Diego Suarez and opened fire with her 15-inch guns. Each shell weighed 1,900 pounds. They fell on French positions with devastating effect, collapsing buildings, cratering streets, destroying ammunition dumps. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes. Silence followed. British infantry advanced at 0700 hours. They expected heavy resistance. Instead, they found chaos. The naval bombardment had shattered French defensive positions, killed dozens of troops, and destroyed the cohesion of the defense. Some French units continued fighting from rubble. Others surrendered. Still others simply fled, abandoning weapons and equipment. By 1400 hours on May 6th, British forces controlled most of Diego Suarez. The harbor remained contested. French colonial troops, supported by naval personnel from the ships in port, held the waterfront and docks. They had machine guns positioned in warehouses, rifles firing from upper-story windows, and sufficient ammunition to sustain resistance for days. Sturgis faced a choice: reduce the resistance with artillery and naval gunfire, guaranteeing heavy civilian casualties and destruction of port facilities Britain needed intact, or attempt to negotiate surrender. He chose negotiation. At 1600 hours, he sent an officer under a white flag to contact the French commander. The French response was unequivocal: no surrender. The garrison would fight until ordered to cease by proper authority, meaning Governor-General Annett, who was in Antananarivo, the island's capital. 400 miles south, Annett had no intention of surrendering anything. From his perspective, Britain had committed an act of war against French territory. Resistance was both legal and necessary. The deadlock continued through May 7th. British forces consolidated their control of Diego Suarez, while French holdouts in the harbor area kept up harassing fire. Casualties mounted slowly. A sniper here, a mortar round there. Men dying for a harbor neither side wanted destroyed. The absurdity of the situation became apparent to officers on both sides. But orders were orders. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. At 2100 hours on May 7th, 50 Royal Marines from HMS Ramillies, led by Captain Martin Price, embarked in 2 motor launches and set off across Diego Suarez Harbor in darkness. Their mission: land behind French lines, infiltrate the town, and create enough chaos to collapse the defense. Price's force landed at a small wharf on the eastern side of the harbor at 2200 hours. They moved through unlit streets, avoiding French patrols, heading toward the barracks where the garrison headquarters was believed located. At 2300 hours, they attacked. Grenades exploded. Automatic weapons fired. The French, believing a major assault was underway, began abandoning their positions. By 0200 hours on May 8th, organized French resistance in Diego Suarez had collapsed. Captain Price, with 50 men, had accomplished what a full brigade could not. The garrison surrendered at 0600 hours. British forces occupied the port, disarmed French troops, and raised the Union Jack over the harbor master's office. Diego Suarez was secure, but Madagascar was not. Governor-General Annett refused to acknowledge the surrender. From Antananarivo, he declared the defense would continue. Vichy France, through broadcasts from Paris, condemned the British invasion as treachery and ordered all French forces on Madagascar to resist. The island's garrison, approximately 8,000 troops dispersed across hundreds of miles, remained loyal to Annett and Vichy. Churchill faced a new decision. The original objective, securing Diego Suarez to prevent Japanese use, had been achieved. But leaving Vichy forces in control of the rest of Madagascar meant leaving a hostile presence in the Indian Ocean, one that could facilitate Axis operations even without direct Japanese involvement. German and Italian submarines were already operating in the Indian Ocean. If Vichy allowed them to refuel and resupply at Madagascan ports, the threat to Allied shipping would persist. The decision was made to occupy the entire island. This expansion of objectives created immediate problems. The force that captured Diego Suarez was adequate for a limited operation. Conquering an island the size of Madagascar required more troops, more supplies, more time. The rainy season was approaching, which would turn primitive roads into impassable mud. Malaria and other tropical diseases were endemic. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean vulnerable to submarine attack. Reinforcements arrived in July, the 29th Brigade from East Africa, the 22nd Brigade from South Africa. Total forces now exceeded 30,000 troops, but Madagascar's size and terrain meant that even this number was insufficient for rapid conquest. The island had minimal infrastructure. One main road connected Diego Suarez in the north to Antananarivo in the center and Tuliar in the south. The road was unpaved, narrow, and vulnerable to ambush. French forces, though outnumbered, exploited these advantages. They couldn't win a conventional battle, but they could delay, harass, and inflict casualties. Colonial troops conducted hit-and-run attacks on British convoys. They demolished bridges, blocked roads with felled trees, and mined likely British routes. They couldn't stop the British advance, but they could make it slow and costly. The campaign devolved into a pursuit across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. British forces advanced methodically, securing each town and village, repairing infrastructure, establishing supply dumps. French forces retreated ahead of them, contesting river crossings and mountain passes, then falling back when threatened with envelopment. At Majunga, on the west coast, British forces conducted another amphibious landing on September 10th. The objective: cut French lines of communication and force Anet to divide his forces. The landing succeeded with minimal opposition. French defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, withdrew inland. By September 20th, Majunga was secure and British forces were advancing east toward Antananarivo. The capital fell on September 23rd. British troops entered the city to find it evacuated. Anet had withdrawn south with his remaining forces, approximately 2,000 troops, determined to continue resistance. The campaign had now lasted nearly 5 months, cost hundreds of casualties, and showed no sign of ending. It ended through exhaustion, not defeat. On November 5th, 1942, Anet agreed to surrender negotiations. His forces were scattered, running out of ammunition, and isolated from any possibility of resupply. Vichy France could send no reinforcements. Local support was eroding as the occupation's costs became apparent. Continued resistance served no purpose except prolonging suffering. The surrender was formalized on November 6th. Anet and his staff became prisoners of war. French colonial troops were disarmed and released. Madagascar came under British military administration, later transferred to Free French forces loyal to Charles de Gaulle. The campaign's final accounting was sobering. British and South African casualties, approximately 500 killed and wounded. French casualties, approximately 2,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Malagasy civilian casualties, unknown but likely in the thousands from disease, displacement, and collateral damage. The strategic justification remained debatable. The Japanese never attempted to occupy Madagascar. No evidence emerged of German or Italian plans to use the island's ports. The invasion prevented a threat that may have been entirely hypothetical. But in war, preventing worst-case scenarios often means acting on incomplete information. British planners believed the risk of Japanese occupation was real. They acted accordingly. The operation demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of amphibious warfare. The Diego Suarez landing succeeded despite primitive landing craft and limited naval gunfire support. But expanding from a limited objective to full island occupation strained resources and diverted forces needed elsewhere. The East African and South African brigades committed to Madagascar spent 6 months on an operation that contributed nothing to the main theaters in North Africa. Burma, or the Atlantic. Vichy France's response revealed the complexities of French politics during the war. Vichy forces fought hard, not because they supported Germany, but because they believed defending French territory was their duty. Many officers and soldiers despised Britain for refusing to accept France's defeat in 1940. The invasion of Madagascar confirmed their view of Britain as an unreliable ally, pursuing imperial interests under the guise of strategic necessity. Free French forces, nominally Britain's allies, were furious they had been excluded from the operation. De Gaulle viewed Madagascar as French territory that should have been liberated by Free French forces, not occupied by British troops. The decision to transfer administration to Free France in January 1943 came too late to repair the damage to Allied unity. The campaign also exposed British amphibious capabilities' severe limitations in early 1942. The landing craft were inadequate. Naval gunfire support, though effective, was uncoordinated with ground operations. Air support from carriers was limited by the small number of available aircraft. Intelligence about terrain and French defenses proved incomplete. These deficiencies were corrected in subsequent operations. Lessons learned in Madagascar applied to Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. The local population paid the highest price. Madagascar's economy, already fragile, collapsed under military occupation. Rice cultivation was disrupted. Trade stopped. Inflation destroyed savings. Disease spread unchecked as medical services broke down. British authorities estimated that 50,000 Malagasy civilians died from war-related causes between May and November 1942, primarily from disease and starvation. These deaths received no attention in contemporary accounts. British and South African forces focused on their own casualties and the tactical challenges of the campaign. Civilian suffering was noted in reports but not acted upon. Post-war, Madagascar's experience during the occupation was largely forgotten, overshadowed by larger campaigns and more dramatic events. But for the people of Madagascar, the invasion was catastrophic. It brought war to an island that had been at peace. It disrupted lives, destroyed livelihoods, and killed thousands for reasons that had nothing to do with Madagascan interests. The strategic logic that justified Operation Ironclad made no allowance for these costs. The submarines that participated in the initial reconnaissance remained on station after Diego Suarez fell. They patrolled the Mozambique Channel, hunted Axis submarines, and reported shipping movements. One of them, HMS Auriga, sank a Japanese submarine at 10 on June 3, 1942. The submarine had been conducting reconnaissance of Madagascar, possibly preparing for the very operation Britain had invaded to prevent. Whether Japan actually intended to occupy the island remains unknown. The sinking of I-10 eliminated one piece of evidence either way. HMS Ramillies, the battleship that had bombarded Diego Suarez, remained in the Indian Ocean for the rest of the war. She never fired her main guns in anger again after May 6, 1942. Her contribution to the campaign, those 40 minutes of bombardment, proved decisive. Without that fire support, the assault on Diego Suarez would have been far more costly, possibly failed altogether. The carriers, illustrious and indomitable, returned to the Mediterranean, where they participated in Operation Pedestal, the desperate convoy to relieve Malta. Both ships were damaged in that operation. Illustrious survived the war. Indomitable was scrapped in 1955. Their aircraft, the Swordfish and Albacores that had bombed Ironclad airfield, were obsolete even in 1942. Fabric-covered biplanes serving in an age of metal monoplanes. But they did the job, proving that determination and training could offset technical inferiority. The troops who fought on Madagascar dispersed to other theaters. 5th South African Division went to North Africa. Participating in the Italian campaign, Force 121's units reinforced Burma, fighting against the Japanese in terrain even worse than Madagascar. Many of the men who survived Diego Suarez died later in Sicily, at Monte Cassino, in the jungles of Burma. Governor-General Annette spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. After liberation, he faced trial for collaborating with Vichy. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, later reduced. He maintained until his death that he had acted correctly, defending French territory against British aggression. From a certain perspective, he was right. Madagascar was French. Britain invaded without legal justification. That the invasion served strategic purposes did not alter its nature. Captain Martin Price, the Royal Marine who led 50 men into Diego Suarez in darkness and broke the deadlock, received the Distinguished Service Order. His action demonstrated what irregular warfare could achieve when properly executed. Maximum impact from minimal force, the principles he employed: infiltration, surprise, and creating chaos at the enemy's decision-making center would become standard special operations doctrine. At 0500 hours on May 5, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Maiden peered through his periscope at Diego Suarez Harbor, gathering intelligence for an invasion that would unfold in hours. He noted positions, counted ships, observed routines. His submarine survived the war. He did not. Killed when HMS Severn was lost with all hands in the Mediterranean in 1943, another name on another memorial. Another life spent in strategic calculations that seemed so clear in planning and so ambiguous in execution. Operation Ironclad prevented what it was designed to prevent, though whether that threat was real or imagined remains unclear. It secured Diego Suarez, occupied Madagascar, and demonstrated Allied capability to project power across vast distances. It also killed thousands, disrupted an entire society, and left scars that outlasted the war. The operation was both success and tragedy. Its necessity as debatable as its execution was competent. The fortress that wasn't needed. The invasion that couldn't be avoided. The campaign that achieved its objectives while raising questions about whether those objectives justified their cost. Madagascar in 1942 encapsulated the moral complexity of total war, where right action and necessary action diverged, where strategic logic overrode legal principle, and where consequences extended far beyond military accounting to touch lives that had no voice in the decisions that destroyed them.